Plato on Writing and Doing Philosophy by John Fisher. Among the various problems engendered by a thoughtful reading of Plato are the puzzles about language. Many of these may only be a matter of concern and study for experts in specialized disciplines, but one problem confronts every reader: the relevance of the writing of philosophy to the doing of philosophy. In what appears to be an extremely paradoxical attitude toward the relationship between the written and the spoken word, Plato lays the groundwork for a theory in which he finds his answers to certain persistent problems of language and philosophy, and therein a rather striking notion of the nature of philosophical activity. I wish to examine some features of the Phaedrus which illuminate this concept. There was a time when, perhaps more than now, the Phaedrus was debated in terms of what it was all about. Indeed, the shibboleth of a Platonic scholar was whether he said love or rhetoric in answer to the Phaedrus question. Rhetoric seems to have had much of the better of the argument, at least statistically, yet all of the effort expended in defending one or the other alternative is wasted. Of course, the Phaedrus is about eros. Of course, it is about rhetoricus, but what is Plato getting at in this strange melange of such diverse subjects? I wish to suggest what at first seems all too obvious, that the Phaedrus is about philosophy, and then argue that its critical imagery might provide a clue to Plato's conception of philosophy and its relationship to language. It is most apparent, after even the most casual reading of the Phaedrus, that Plato wishes to make some sharp contrasts between rhetoric, which in the dialogues he repeatedly calls flattery, and genuine philosophy. Books and speeches, the functions of which are to entertain, to provide recreation for the creator, or at best to remind the reader or listener of what he has earlier learned, are, for the most part, a frivolous pastime. Philosophy, on the other hand, has a much more noble function. The difference between rhetoric and philosophy is paralleled in the contrast of the written word and the living and breathing word of him who knows that of which the written word is the image. Unless a man has attained the truth, he would do well not to write at all, and even then, writing is hardly more than recreation. In spite of this denigration of rhetoric, Plato yet believes it can have a persuasive use, which need not be entirely bad. There is a good rhetoric, that which has a good for its object and which is technically without flaw. The motive for its use must be a high one, but its use is always in the area of practical everyday concerns, and especially public affairs. This view of the importance of rhetoric to politics and the distinction between effective rhetoric in the area of public affairs and the heuristic activities of merely ambitious men was rather generally shared by most of the first-rate rhetors of the day. See, for example, Isocrates' Letter 5 to Alexander, and was hardly a Platonic innovation. Plato, however, demanded that good rhetoric be related to truth, not just as an instrument of communication, but as an activity of a man who has real knowledge. Thus, only the philosopher could really be trusted with this tool, and most rhetors were far from being philosophers. The distinction which Socrates is continually making in the dialogues between what we might call natural knowledge of phenomena and truth is implied in his insistence in the early passages of the Phaedrus that trees and fields can't teach him anything, but man can. Truth has an essential inward character to which nature cannot contribute, nor can nature grasp it. And always Socrates discovers that men teach him, not by rhetoric, not by writing books or making speeches, but by becoming vitally involved in that fascinating and contagious activity we call dialogue. All else is sophistry or soliloquy. In the 7th epistle, Plato argues that in spite of rumors reaching him that a number of persons have tried to write books about his doctrine, he is confident that none of them really understood what it was all about, else they would never have attempted to write. Such writers can, in my opinion, have no real acquaintance with the subject. I certainly have composed no work in regard to it, nor shall I ever do so in the future, for there is no way of putting it in words like other studies. Acquaintance with it must come rather after a long period of attendance or instruction in the subject itself, and of close companionship, when, suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, it is generated in the soul and at once becomes self-sustaining. Further, he insists that if anyone could do it, he could. Yet, the idea of the attempt is reprehensible to him. It could not be done adequately. First, because the subject matter does not lend itself to ordinary verbal instruction, and second, because average readers are not capable of any response save that of unjustified contempt, or, what is worse, the vain and mistaken notion that they have learned philosophy. Only a few who are capable of discovering the truth for themselves with a little guidance would at all profit. Therefore, no intelligent man would be so bold or foolish as to attempt to put into words the results of contemplation, especially not in a form that is unalterable, which must be the case with what is expressed in written symbols. Somehow, the written word never gets through to the soul in any way adequate for knowledge or truth. Yet there is hope, even for Lysias, proudest of the speech writers, for as Socrates prays, "Make him to cease from speeches of this sort, and turn him to philosophy, in order that his lover also here before thee may no longer hold between two opinions, but heart and soul devote his life to love with philosophic talk." Or, extending the imagery of the previous sections, let him grow wings. The wing is a crucial philosophical symbol in the Phaedrus, and these passages are central to understanding the dialogue and grasping Plato's understanding of philosophy. Among the numerous mythic and symbolic references to wings in the Phaedrus, none is as puzzling and fascinating as the poetic identification of Eros and Pteros. In the delightful first speech of Socrates, there is a rather complicated imagistic explanation of Eros, within which the difference between human and divine love is explored. Socrates, aware of the probable mocking response of his hearer to his suggestion, nevertheless turns to the secret and undoubtedly apocryphal Homeric writings and quotes the lines, "Mortals call him fluttering love, but immortals call him winged one, because the growing of wings is a necessity to him." Or, as others, convinced that Plato is punning on the similarity of Pter and pater, translated: Though mortal men call Eros winged love, gods call him Pteros, for he fathers wings. One cannot read the Phaedrus unaccompanied by the fanciful rustling of wings. There are winged horses, winged chariots, winged charioteers, winged souls. Plato even suggests that those who are united by erotomania get wings of the same feather in heaven for their love's sake. Indeed, the early Greeks were even more preoccupied with wings than Plato. Bird divinities are associated with the earliest rites, and when Athena became goddess of the city, her owl came with her. The poets found symbolic expression for their art in the wing. If the writing of the birds shocked Athenians, it was not because of its title, nor Aristophanes' overwhelming wing imagery. The use of the wing symbol might suggest lightness, as in the Timaeus, birds have their biological origin in light-headed men, or escape, as in the Protagoras, or swiftness, not only of birds, but of arrows, guided and made swift and direct by feathers. Somewhere in the Olympian Odes, Pindar sings of shafts of song, launched from the muse's fast-speeding bow, a winged arrow of sweet song. The Phaedrus passage does contain a symbolic reference to wings, but it contains something more. This was not just any poem, but a Homeric poem. The scores of references to Homer in the dialogues indicate that Plato had more than a superficial acquaintance with the poet. To overlook passages on wing, noted by Homeric scholars, would be to miss a crucial point in Plato's exposition. In contrast to Plato's winging of various objects in the Phaedrus is the conspicuous winging in Homeric writings of one particular entity: words. Even the most distant recollection of the Iliad or the Odyssey will bring to mind the almost monotonous repetitions of the striking expression, winged words. Winged words are used by Homer in several contextual situations. I shall designate these categories in the Iliad and Odyssey in order of the frequency of their occurrence as follows: winged words of declaration, winged words of command, winged words of interrogation, winged words of chiding, winged ceremonial words, winged words of triumph, and winged words of supplication. In each case, I wish to suggest that the response to the winged word is the clue to the metaphor, and that the Homeric understanding of the metaphor may help to clarify Plato's notion of philosophy. Winged words of declaration are reducible to declarative sentences. Athene addresses Hector in winged words. Agamemnon speaks to Nestor in winged words. With winged words, Sleep addresses Poseidon, Arete speaks winged words to Odysseus, Deiphobos spoke winged words. In these, and in many more instances, gods or men speak winged words at crucial moments, and these words have interesting effects. On almost every occasion in the Odyssey, the reply to the winged word of declaration is in words. On the other hand, in the Iliad, the winged word of declaration is answered in words about half the time, and on other occasions by direct action. On no occasion is the winged word ignored. The responses to winged words of command are almost always actions. On certain occasions, Homer allows his characters to respond in entreaty or dialogue. In the vast majority of cases, however, the commanding winged words are responded to by action, a stirring up of the hearer, or an immediate following of an inspired leader. The effect of the winged words of interrogation is always to elicit a verbal response. Achilles, for example, questions in winged words a weeping Patroclus concerning his grief, and Patroclus replies in a moving speech designed to allay the anger of sulking Achilles. And Odysseus, whose question to the swineherd, "Who is your lord?" is asked in winged words, gets a prompt verbal reply. The winged words of chiding, on the other hand, are seldom met with words, but always with action. Athene chides Telemachus in winged words. If he had a drop of his father's blood, he would act, and Telemachus made no longer tarrying when he heard her voice. Poseidon rallied the Achaeans with winged words of shame and stirred up the Achaeans. Often, Homer's characters use winged words for greeting, farewell, and on other ceremonial occasions. At times, these result in an obvious reply. "Hail! Hail also to you!" On other occasions, no word is spoken in reply, but an answering action suggests a powerful communication. When Odysseus spoke the winged farewell to and blessing on Arete, Homer adds, "She did not speak," but reports that she immediately, in her depth of feeling, sent a cloak and a shirt and wine and bread to his ship. Passionate speeches of triumph or derision become winged for Homer, and for obvious reasons, replies are infrequent. Patroclus' silence at the winged words of triumph, shouted over him by Hector, is understandable, for he is dead, and when Odysseus props the annoying beggar against the wall and shouts in winged words, "Sit there and scare off the swine and dogs," there is no reply, because, for one thing, Odysseus has broken his jaw. Often such words of derision are spoken either for the spectators or, as in the flush of victory or height of rage, function solely as an emotional expressive release. The winged words of supplication evoke verbal responses which, of course, demand fulfillment in action. When Telemachus, thinking Odysseus to be a god, pleads, "Be gracious to us, we entreat," Odysseus replies, "I am no god," and kisses his son. But when terror-stricken Lycaon pleads with Achilles in winged words to spare his life, Achilles answers pitilessly, "Fool, before Patroclus came to his destiny, it was the way of my heart to spare the Trojans, but not now." And Lycaon dies without mercy and without dignity. Now, reflecting on the almost excessive use of the metaphor in Homer, and considering the conspicuous characteristics of the event in each case, one is impressed, not with the poetic or aesthetic aspects of winged words, but with the realization that they are important because of the response that inevitably attends them. Never do we read, "He spoke in winged words and nothing happened," nor do we read the written winged words, nor are winged words addressed to a rock or a shield or to the air. Definitive characteristics of Homer's winged words, then, are spoken words addressed to rational beings and provocative of a significant response. Winged words go from mind to mind, heart to heart, feeling to feeling, and even if, on occasion, they produce a result different from the expectation, they always have an effect, they always do something. Without utterance, there can be no winged words. Note the numerous references to unwinged words. The word unwinged abode with her. Odyssey 17, 57. Her answer found no wings. Odyssey 19:29. Yet, winged words do not merely fly between persons, they penetrate the indifference of men and make it impossible to be inattentive to the meaning. Wings take dead words and make them live by transporting them to the responsive soul of the hearer, the part of man closest to the divine. The natural property of wings is to raise that which is heavy and carry it aloft to the region where the gods dwell. Plato was not unaware of, nor indifferent to Homeric insights. Even the expressive device, men call him some word, but the gods call him some other word, is Homeric, appearing, for instance, on a number of occasions in the Iliad. It is inconceivable that the writer who quotes Homer as often as does Plato would use the wing imagery that permeates the Phaedrus without a thought of the Homeric metaphor, and the metaphor, in Platonic terms, tells us that although written words have no wings, the words of philosophy, the ultimate activity of the completely erotic man, do. The true lover is the philosopher, that daimonic man whose understanding of the important things precludes the possibility that a speech or a book could communicate his knowledge to another. Rather, the truth comes as an illumination, only realizable after long association, conversation, exposure to elencas, and ultimate dialectical activity in the companionship of one who knows. And this companionship brings us back again to Eros and those attachments that raise so many eyebrows when Plato is first read. The written word, speeches, lectures, sermons, rhetoric can have a certain effectiveness. They can persuade. They can demand intellectual assent, yet, without Eros, they constitute a continual threat, not only political, but psychological and intellectual as well. In The Eclipse of God, Martin Buber records a moment of singular rhetorical success and the accompanying sense of total failure. The listener, silent throughout the speech, responded slowly and impressively, "You are right." The barrenness of mere intellectual assent struck Buber with dismay. He had no time to remain with the man. He could not do the things necessary to rectify his error. He could not enter into a live relationship with the man. He could not be his companion, his friend. He could only return his gaze. Yet, for Plato, mere friendship will not do. "Friendship," wrote Lord Byron in a very Platonic mood, "is love without his wings." Friendship might produce a rhetor, but not a philosopher. The true philosopher, constitutionally erotic and disciplined in dialectic, alone possesses a winged soul. Thus equipped, Plato tells us, the soul flies upward to partake of the divine forms of beauty, wisdom, and goodness. The divine philosophy is not available to the unwinged soul, which, burdened by its own nature, fastens on something earthy and remains insensitive to the vision of reality. Yet Plato is not suggesting that wings are given by fate or fortuitously. Wings grow and shrivel, are nourished and are stunted. Philosophers do not sit in lonely intellectual detachment, they love. They do not write books, they plant the seeds of love in the souls of men. And the seeds are the winged words the true lovers whisper to the disciples who, as youths, feel the first stirrings of growth and in full maturity soar, not on another's, but on their own wings, and repeat the cycle of vision, love, communication, conceptualization, birth. Socrates is the truly erotic man, the genuine philosopher whose winged words soar to the regions where alone truth and knowledge can be found. Socrates never wrote, Plato states in Phaedo 60d, until he found himself in prison and about to die, when, in a moment of deep introspection, he thought it safer to write some verses in honor of Apollo, just in case he had misinterpreted the constant dream in which he heard the command to make music. It is important in this regard to note that the myth of the origin of written language in the Phaedrus is not taken from Homer. The old Greeks had no concern for writing, for written words were dead, and Socrates, always in the spirit of the old Greece, would not write. The discovery of the written language was not, according to the myth, Greek, but Egyptian, and the art of writing was hardly a miraculous divine gift, but more of an interesting scientific discovery. Even the god Thamos was skeptical of this supposed blessing to the Egyptians, and indeed his criticism is a Socratic emendation to the tale, for he argues that the ingenious discovery will cause memory to ossify. Men will trust writing and not recollection. They will hear much and write much and learn nothing, appear wise and be fools. Socrates, whose criticism of rhetoric contains his blunt comment upon the written word, "They are just like books, incapable of either answering you or putting a question of their own," did not write. Yet Plato, who understood Socrates perhaps better than any other man, did. If the true philosopher, having thought out these things, is conscious of his own constitutional antipathy toward the written word, the problem of Plato's writings looms large. There is a temptation in reading the Phaedrus to make of Plato the ex-playwright a non-philosopher, a totally literary figure. Surely he is arguing that not even Socrates' philosophy can be mastered by reading Plato's books. Are they then intended to be literary, not philosophical works, designed for the intellectual entertainment of the sophisticated man, or the intellectual game-playing of academy students? Motives aside, the dialogues are, of course, about philosophy, and they provide a great deal of information about Plato's thought. The question, however, is how Plato understood them and what he intended them to be. Too much has been written and too little known about Plato's academy. Great imaginative efforts, intriguing as they may be, contribute little to a real understanding of what went on. One thing seems clear, however. Unless Plato was grossly inconsistent, his doing philosophy in the academy was conspicuously unlike reading dialogues to his students. Philosophers, of course, do many worthwhile things in addition to doing philosophy. We acquaint students with the history of ideas, which is not doing philosophy, nor is enriching their appreciation of the arts, nor counseling, nor sitting on committees. Plato, in addition to doing philosophy, wrote dialogues, the echoes of Socrates' winged words. Yet, the study of the dialogues, if they were used in the academy, could only have been an introduction to doing philosophy, a propedeutic to dialectic. The vital teaching aspect of Plato's professional life must have remained in this category, which Aristotle in Physics 209b calls Plato's agrapha dogmata, the judgments that were not written down. The problem of the dialogues is not the question of what Plato did in the academy, but what he intended these writings to be. If indeed these account of Plato's ability both to do philosophy in Socrates' sense and to write dialogues in an accurate one, the tensions which seem repeatedly to hover about the man and his career are more readily understandable. Commentators have at times suggested that the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, mentioned in Republic 607b, was Plato's internal struggle. For example, see Friedlander, Plato, page 122. Indeed, the text lends credence to this, for it is not merely a historically interesting old quarrel, but a quarrel from old times. Philosophy is not poetry, and poetry is not philosophy. To be sure, Plato never abrogates the right of poetry to plead her defense anew and to return from exile. Republic 607d. To do so, poetry would have to change its nature radically, but it would always be poetry, never philosophy. Plato was not, of course, a frustrated vocational schizoid, yet he felt these tensions deeply, and there is some reason to believe that the tensions themselves were to him necessary and useful. In the Laws, 816d, he writes, "Serious things cannot be understood without laughable things, nor opposites at all without opposites, if a man is really to have intelligence of either. But he cannot carry out both in action if he is to have any degree of virtue." The context is a discussion of entertainment, and the serious things are the works of the serious poets, the tragedians, not the philosophers. Yet, the generalization is consistent with all of Plato's teaching. Playfulness is useful, even necessary for seriousness, but it can never be identified with seriousness. Socratic dialogues are useful for education, but even Socratic dialogues cannot take the place of philosophy. The fact that much of what has been taken as philosophy since Plato would not stand if we let him judge is an interesting historical accretion to the account, but hardly evaluative. Aristotle did philosophy, but many of his works appearing on philosophy shelves are not even word pictures of philosophy being done in Plato's sense. Yet, it would seem quite consistent with Plato's view that philosophy, in spite of its essentially social nature, could be done in isolation. But this would demand a dialogue with oneself. Socrates' description of thinking, given in Theaetetus 189e, is just this: a discourse that the mind comes on with itself when the mind is thinking. It is simply talking to itself, asking questions and answering them, and saying yes or no. There seems to be little doubt that Socrates himself was capable of such inward conversation. One could imagine Socrates' discourse on love in the Symposium, with the curious involvement of Diotima, as a covert instance of Socrates talking to himself about Eros. Thus, it remains that dialogue has a double meaning, corresponding to the spoken, winged word and the written, unwinged word. True philosophy is a social activity. Its language is living and responsive, its words winged. It asks and answers. This is living dialogue with a live philosopher. Plato's written dialogues are not dialogue in this sense, but a record of how perhaps the greatest of philosophers did philosophy. The portrait of the man, the structure of the activity. Dialogue in the first sense is a necessary condition for doing philosophy. Dialogue, in the second sense, is an art form. Yet, under the masterful hand of Plato, the art form reached a height and a grandeur never equaled. Nevertheless, the written word remains unwinged. The only way to do philosophy is to go out and find a philosopher. Unless Plato is completely mistaken, his words alone have wings. One difficulty remains. In the accounts of Socrates as doing philosophy, which may or may not have historical accuracy, it does not matter here. Socrates is pictured as a rather skillful user of the devices which seem to be the property of literary men. He uses myth, allegory, parable, analogy, and all the other effective tools of this art. Surely there is no troubling restriction on the literary men, whose goal is the evoking of a certain response, the engendering of a certain kind of experience. But the philosopher's goal is truth. Can he, qua philosopher, even in oral discourse, find a reasonable and consistent use for these devices? The question does not probe the necessity of using the technique of the literary man. Clearly, there is no necessity, and there is nothing in Plato's picture which demands of it of the philosopher in general. The puzzle is, can the philosopher consistently use literary devices, and if so, under what circumstances? One must not lose sight of Plato's determined vision of Socrates as the consummate example of a metaphysician. Plato's Socrates not only sets rigid limits for descriptive analysis, but thinks seriously about transcending the limits. Undoubtedly, the resultant philosophy is one-sided and suffers from its neglect of natural science. Nevertheless, the picture of Socrates is a steady and consistent one. He was metaphysician, not natural scientist, myth-maker, not pointer reader. In the explication of the ontological ideal, in the pursuit of truth, Socrates, the man who would not write, found himself using the tools of the writer for different ends. The writer uses myth, allegory, and the like to further the ends of his art, to evoke certain aesthetic or psychological or other responses. Socrates uses these devices to further the ends of his art, to hint at truths inaccessible to descriptive analysis. In Plato's view, therefore, the instrumentalities of literature are justified in philosophy by the lofty ends of the discipline itself. It was not Plato who said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Wittgenstein, Tractatus 5.6. Plato's comment was, "No intelligent man will ever be so bold as to put into language those things which his reason has contemplated, especially not in a form that is unalterable," which must be the case with what is expressed in written symbols. Episode 7, 343.